If you've been looking to buy your own home or invest and are considering Brisbane versus Perth, then this is the video for you. Now, in this video, we've looked at 50 years worth of data and the current state of both markets and talked about the pros and cons of each city. Now, when I looked at the long-term performance of Brisbane versus Perth between 1976 and 2016 over a 50-year period, I found that Brisbane had averaged 9.7% per annum and Perth had done about 8.2% per annum, giving Brisbane the upper hand from a long-term capital growth perspective. Now, the next thing I was considering when looking to invest personally in the next 12 months was the economy and the state of the current markets. Now, Brisbane is a highly diversified market with heaps of government jobs, health jobs, university, tourism. It's also got mining. It's got all the big sporting stuff as well. Where unfortunately one of the major downsides with Perth, and that's why its longer term performance has suffered a little bit, as it's always been a bit of a one-trick town. Now, obviously at the moment, the commodity market is hot and heaps. In fact, hundreds of thousands of people from around the world and Australia have been flocking to Perth in the last few years to take advantage of the current commodities and mining boom. But if you're interested in investing in Perth longer term, then you've just got to recognize there are periods of incredible growth and then longer term periods where the growth flatlines or potentially even declines. From that perspective right now, I think Brisbane wins the battle of the most diversified economy with the most longer term potential. Now, the next thing when I'm looking at is, can I afford to buy in the market? Now, Sydney and Melbourne are extremely expensive right now. And since the last GFC, they've both basically doubled in value, which is the main reason why I'm looking at Brisbane and Perth in this video. Now, if we look at Perth first, there are some parts of the market in the inner city and beach that have doubled in value in the last 10 years, and that's true with Brisbane as well. But there are other parts of Perth, after I just looked at over 300 suburbs, where the average annual growth rate has been that 8% plus over 50 years, but in the last 10 to 12 years has been literally under 2% per annum. When I did the same thing for Brisbane and looked at over 300 suburbs in Brisbane recently, there are also some suburbs that have done extremely well and doubled since the last GFC, close to the city and some of the beaches, where others have only done around about 5, maybe 6% per annum. So from an affordability perspective at the moment, Perth is coming off a lower base in the last 10 years and has some extremely affordable suburbs close to the CBD. The next thing I look at as an investor, the demographics. So things like the percentage of renters living there, the percentage of owner-occupiers, the average household incomes, along with things like savings rates and equity rates in homes. Now, Perth at the moment, because of the commodities boom and the nature of the work over there, has the strongest incomes out of any capital city in Australia. Brisbane is massively benefiting from the people that have been moving up from the southern states since the start of COVID. And Brisbane right now has the strongest population growth rate out of any capital city in Australia. I think when you look at longer term averages and incomes versus house prices, both Brisbane and Perth are extremely affordable right now for the average investor. Now, the next thing that's important as an investor is vacancy rates. Now, in Australia, anything below 2% would be classified as a market that is undersupplied. Anything between 2 and 3% would be a normal market. Anything over 3% rental vacancy rate would be considered oversupplied. Now, Brisbane at the moment has rental vacancy rates at about 1%, and Perth has vacancy rates a little bit below 1%. The difference between the two cities, though, when you look at the last 10 to 15 years, is the fluctuations in vacancy rates. Now, Brisbane, depending on the type of product, has gone from half of 1%, which many suburbs in the city are right now, through to about 3%, where unfortunately Perth has had a really, really rough history. So after the mining boom that ended at the end of the last GFC, literally 500,000 people bailed Perth, and it resulted in vacancy rates in some suburbs being as high as 10 to 15%, which even back in 2017 and 18, the average time it took to find a tenant when the vacancy rates were up at 10% was more than 50 days. So from that perspective, I think Brisbane wins the long-term averages, but Perth's vacancy rate at the moment, with that influx of people and not a huge amount of new development, has been extremely strong as of right now. Although big picture wise, both of the cities literally have the lowest vacancy rate in recorded history right now, and both look incredible as investment. Now, when we look at the actual house prices or townhouse prices versus rent returns, the rents are obviously extremely strong in Perth at the moment, mainly because in many of the suburbs, house prices haven't really gone up much more than 20 or 30% since the last GFC. So it's it's not uncommon over there for you to go buy a property worth 500 or 550K. The rent's between 500 and 600 bucks per week. Although the same is true over here in Brisbane, where rents in the last 2 years have increased by between an average of $100 and $200 per week per suburb, with CoreLogic suggesting that rents in Brizzy should increase by at least another $100 per week because of the massive amount of population growth over the 2023-2024 year. Now, the next thing I think about as an investor is the long-term potential for capital growth and the risks that I'm prepared to take for that. Now, unfortunately, when you look at the longer-term history of Perth, there is a fair amount of risk in that market, only because it goes up so quickly based on speculation from all of Australia and the people moving over there for those jobs at the same time, but then everybody else coming back to the East Coast once that mining boom or commodities runs ends. So Perth is certainly a market, historically speaking, where it's more of a boom and bust town, where Brisbane has been that sort of more consistent, longer-term performer without as many down years over the last 50 or 100. Now, I think Brisbane has a very, very, very important and big ticket item on the horizon that nowhere else in Australia shares, and that is the 2032 Brisbane Olympic Games. Now, these games are going to be absolutely massive. It looks like they're going to have to employ around about 100,000 people in preparation for those games. Massive, massive amounts of infrastructure going in the Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast and Brisbane as we speak. And off the back of that, income's rising and population spiking. I think off the back of that, infrastructure-wise, Brisbane is punching massively nationally above its weight with the COVID infrastructure bailout plan, the coming Olympic Games, plus all of the hospitals, schools, universities, trains, and major road networks being upgraded as we speak in the Goldie, Sunny Coast and Brisbane. I think infrastructure-wise, Brisbane looks incredible. Now, one of the cool things about both cities is they're not just one property market, there are segments within the market. Now, if we look at the cheapest and entry point to both of those markets, without looking at units, which you should never buy because of the longer-term history, where we know that over 30 years, houses and townhouses have massively outperformed units. But if we look at the townhouse side of things, which is the entry point, you can buy incredibly high-quality townhouses in both of these cities for under $400,000 right now, either close to the city or the beach. And in some instances in both cities, in the low 300,000s right now. Then there's obviously the step up to the affordable house range. In Brisbane and in Perth, there's many, many parts of the city where you can still buy good quality houses, either close to the city or the beach for sub 600K. Then you jump into that next bracket where there's the inner city and the beachside suburbs in both Perth and Brisbane, where you can get really high quality homes for well below $1 million right now. And then there's obviously the more expensive inner city markets where house prices on those beaches or very, very close to the city have already doubled in value. And, you know, people are spending in both cities $2, $3, $4, $5 million to get what they want. So very, very interesting when you look at the potential for both cities. For me personally, I have a preference in Brisbane, not just because of the things that we've mentioned in the video, but because when I looked at the Australian Bureau of Statistics plan for the next 50 years with the Australian government, we're going to see about 75% of Australia's job, infrastructure and population growth go between Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. It looks like Brisbane is going to get to 5 million people on top of that within the next 20 years, which will mean it's the current size of Sydney or Melbourne. Either way, based on long-term history, in the second stage of the real estate cycle, Brisbane and Perth historically do very, very well. In fact, in the 5 or 6 years leading up to the last GFC, Brisbane and Perth did more than 120% growth each on average. So there is some incredible growth coming in both markets, and we'll see that unfold as we get closer to the end of 2026. Now, for those of you seriously thinking about buying a property in the next 6 to 12 months, I'd love to offer you a one-on-one strategy session. All you have to do is jump over to www.pumpedonproperty.com, click that free strategy session button, And then we can talk about where you are today, where you'd like to be longer term. We can talk about these markets in more detail and the deep analysis that we've done on both of these markets over the last 12 months. And then you can take that with a grain of salt and either go buy in Brisbane or Perth on your own, or potentially become one of the extremely small number of clients that we work with each month. But either way, we wish you all the best on your journey to choices and financial freedom for yourself and your family in your life.
Woo! That's a wrap.
That's a wrap.
Getting
Have a
cool,
spin.
bro. Yeah. Oh, sweaty. So sweaty. Oh, that's good. Look at that.
So nice, eh?
Oh.